Hi, and welcome to another online reflection from the Northwestern Baptist Association. I don't know how familiar you are with the New Testament book of Revelation, but over the years its various narratives and images have actually found their way into our everyday language more than we might realize, and it's become the plot base for movies and novels and all kinds of things, particularly about the end of the world. There's hardly a disaster movie that's been made that hasn't borrowed its imagery in one way or another: fire, flood, sword, famine, plague, stars collapsing, planets colliding, skies darkened, the moon melting, and so I could go on. It's all in there. And here we are in 2020, about, we think, to depart from the European Union here in the UK. And I can remember that when I was a teenager, and it used to be called the EEC, there were those who told me that this was the League of Seven Kings from the book of Revelation that would mark the end of the world. Well, don't panic. I am not going to try and equate what's happening now to all the apocalyptic narratives of Revelation, because it seems to me that the book of Revelation has something far more fundamental to say to us. And that is that above all the trials and tribulations and the power struggles and the conspiracies of this world, God's reign is undaunted. And when all those trials and tribulations and power struggles and conspiracies have run their course, God's kingdom will remain, and God's kingdom will remain for eternity. And what you may not immediately realize is also how much of the language and vocabulary of our worship today is actually drawn from the book of Revelation. Classic hymns like "Come, let us join our cheerful songs with angels round the throne," or more contemporary ones like "At your feet we fall, mighty risen Lord," are all capturing the imagery of that book. And so many phrases that appear in our hymns, like "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain," or "Praise and honour and glory and power to the one who sits on the throne," or "Holy, holy, holy Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." All of these are phrases we find in the book of Revelation, and there are many more that I have not mentioned. And the book of Revelation stands apart from just about all the other books of the New Testament. First of all, you have the Gospel and Acts outlining the history of Jesus' earthly life and then the early life of the church. And then you've got what we call the epistles, letters written by some of the key leaders of the early church to various congregations. And then comes Revelation, which we could say is another letter, in that its opening chapters quite clearly address 7 churches in what is now southern Europe. But it's also quite different from those other letters, because while the writers of those letters were no doubt inspired by God, they were very much writing into the circumstances as they saw them. Whereas John is offering us an account of a vision, an experience of the presence of God, of being drawn into the very throne room of heaven, or as the title says, a revelation, a unique insight into the presence of God. But what I want to invite you to notice are the earthly circumstances in which that all took place, because we might well describe John, the writer of Revelation, as being in lockdown at the time, which of course is an all too familiar experience for us at the moment. But let's be clear, and I don't want to diminish anyone's struggles right now, but John wasn't in lockdown for the good of his health. From what we can gather, he'd been deported to a penal colony, arrested and exiled as part of a wave of persecution against the early church. And however frustrated and confused we may be by the latest wave of restrictions and lockdowns that we're having to live with, however we might even disagree with them, we can at least recognise the underlying narrative that the intent of those who impose all of this are trying to protect us and help us protect others from a deadly disease. John wasn't just in isolation. He'd been removed from his home and his networks of support, and this was done as a direct and deliberate act of oppression. And that's why I wanted to begin by recognizing the impact that the book of Revelation has had over the centuries. Not to draw you into the minutiae and details of its narrative, but to invite you to stand back and recognize that bigger picture. Out of the most difficult and challenging of human circumstances emerges one of the most enduring and influential narratives of human history. And that is what I want to encourage you to recognize. Because if such an amazing account of the presence and the purposes of God can emerge from one person's experience of lockdown, then there's an awful lot of God for us to discover in our own experience of lockdown. Our church buildings may be closed, our services may be suspended, but on the basis of John's experience, this might actually yet be an opportunity, not just to keep our faith ticking over, but to actually discover more of God. So let me read a few verses from the introduction of this book of Revelation, and then we can perhaps reflect on this profound reality. So I'm going to read from Revelation chapter 1 and begin at verse 9. I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. And on the Lord's day I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, Write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches. I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet and with a golden sash round his chest. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. Now, I doubt if any of us are too concerned right now to become the author of an apocalyptic book that can influence society for the next few centuries. But we do have a lot in common with John, the writer of Revelation. We certainly do know what it feels like to suddenly find ourselves removed from our familiar routines and circumstances and having to come to terms with all the uncertainty and disruption and isolation that comes with that. And as I've already said, John is quite clear that these circumstances have come about for him through his faith and his role as a leader within the early church. I was on the island of Patmos, he says, because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. He tells us, and let's be clear, we've probably only been introduced ourselves to Patmos through the pages of a holiday brochure. Roman penal colonies were anything but a holiday destination. But for John, these are just passing details. His reason for writing is far more profound. He has seen the risen Jesus. Now, there's a lot more to come, but even in these opening few verses, we have this quite profound image of this one walking between the lampstands like the Son of Man, hair like wool, eyes like fire. Well, you can read more of those details for yourself if you want to. And there's some continuity here with some of the writings of the Old Testament visionary Daniel, who offers us a very similar vision of someone he calls the Ancient of Days in his writings. But John also recognizes this as the risen and the reigning Jesus. He is seeing in his vision what other New Testament writers offer us in their explanation of Jesus as the Word made flesh, the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, we cannot deny the inevitable human cost of what John was going through. Earlier, he describes himself as a companion in suffering and patient endurance. But in that place of potential despair, when John's life circumstances could reach a new low, the truths of his faith embrace a new reality. He sees with his eyes what he knows in his head. And the unquenchable message of his captivity and his suffering is that I am even more convinced in who Jesus is. I am even more convinced of the reign and the rule of God. Human circumstances that were intended to diminish and destroy his faith simply serve to make him even more certain of its authenticity. And can you see the irony of that? The Roman authorities imprisoned and isolated him to try and stop him from influencing people in the immediate area and time to become followers of Jesus. And they end up creating the circumstances that allow him to influence human thought right across the world for centuries afterwards. You know, you can lock God's people up, but you can't lock God up, and you can't lock God's message up. Now, as I said earlier, I doubt if any of us have any particular aspirations to write a timeless narrative that will still be talked about centuries from now. But we do want to know that God is with us, and that our faith is no less founded when many of our circumstances have changed. And I suspect that this is all John wanted to do that morning when he sat down to reflect, and he found himself quite profoundly in the presence of God. So let's leave the consequences of all of that to God's purposes, and maybe we can just take a few moments to reflect on John's experience as a way of helping us discover more of God's presence in our own circumstances. And it strikes me that this all begins with a very simple and practical attitude of mind. It was the Lord's day, we're told in verse 10. John's physical circumstances may have changed, but he didn't abandon the rhythms of his faith. As far as he was concerned, no matter what happened to him, as that day dawned, it was the Lord's day. And many of us will resonate with that because we live in a society and we're part of a church that is able to retain that practice of setting a day aside to come together in worship. But I'm not saying that that is necessarily the only way. I think the greater principle here is that John established and observed a rhythm which included times of deliberately seeking God's presence, to practice the presence of God, as some have described it. And that required an attitude of mind to his own circumstances and potential distractions. I don't think we should overlook that phrase a verse or so earlier when he describes himself and his fellow believers as companions in suffering, yes, but also companions in patient endurance. If we're going to discover God in the midst of our own circumstances, perhaps we also need to deliberately choose to patiently endure too. You know, human nature is such that we don't find it easy to do that. And we are being bombarded at the moment by narratives of expectation and demands for proof and explanation. And I'm not saying that a lot of those aren't justified, but we can choose. We can choose to be carried along by the narratives of anxiety, or we can choose to patiently endure. And perhaps if we do deliberately make that choice, we just might find ourselves less distracted when it comes to discovering God's presence in the midst of our struggles. And it is then that John discovers that simple yet profound truth. God is there. Yes, there's an image of the risen Jesus that resonates with the narratives of the Old Testament. The imagery is profound and awe-inspiring. But the one like the Son of Man, as John describes him, is walking among 7 lampstands. And we go on to discover, as the narrative continues, that those lampstands represent the churches to which John has been told to write. God is not just God. God is present with his people. And as we seek to discover something of God in our own circumstances, it does us good to hear that assurance that God is here to be found. But God is also God. And I think it's no accident that the figure of Jesus, with whom he would be so familiar, is seen in new perspectives. Perspectives that increasingly show him to be reigning over and above all the powers of this world, to be enthroned. And around the throne are not all the earthly figures of power and authority that are all slugging it out with one another as gradually they're overcome and defeated. But the throne is surrounded by the faithful, the elders and the martyrs. They're the ones who belong at the centre of God's seat of power. Now, as I've already said, I'm not going to draw you into all the detail of the book of Revelation, but I would invite you to follow that bigger dynamic. The more we are drawn into this image of the reign and the rule of God, the less significant the immediately earthly circumstances that we find ourselves in feel. That doesn't mean that John and his fellow believers aren't facing some very real trials and struggles, but they do so as people who belong to something far bigger, something that eclipses anything that human authorities can throw at them. So I want to invite you to put yourself into John's shoes, so to speak, for a few moments. Again, not so that you can pen some timeless apocalypse, but so that you can discover God in your here and now, just like he did. So you know the routine, which really is the first point that I would offer. Where are you creating the space to be present to God? John describes his moment as the Lord's Day. So what's the equivalent of that for you? What routines do you need to establish and maintain as your own experience of lockdown takes its course? And what does it mean to patiently endure? What frustrations and irritations do you need to choose to let go of? Not because those things don't matter or are even unjustified, but because you don't need to be consumed or defined by them. What do you need to release, not only for your own well-being, but also in order to truly focus on God? And then secondly, remind yourself that God is present. The one, like the Son of Man, is walking amongst the lampstands, present with his church, even though his church is disrupted and scattered. The lampstands may have been fixed, but from what is described, the risen Jesus was free to move. God can find you wherever your here and now might be. And as John's subsequent writing goes on to clearly demonstrate, there's an awful lot of God to be found. So for a season, don't focus on the lampstand, so to speak, the structures and the shape of local church. Focus on the one who walks between them. And then finally, remember that you are part of something much bigger, so much bigger. And it's so often the case in biblical narratives that just when John finds himself in trouble, what changes is not his circumstances, but his vision of God. And yeah, much of what is happening in our world at the moment might disturbingly resemble those rulers and those beasts in the later chapters of Revelation, flailing around as they futilely seek to overcome what they ultimately cannot control. And we're impacted by that. John's experience was of the very real human cost of the Roman Empire seeking to impose its control on every aspect of people's lives. But however current circumstances impact on us, we are part of a much bigger story. Let that really inspire you and reassure you, and let that vision of the eternal reign and rule of God put our present realities and struggles into perspective. As I observed earlier, as John is drawn into this vision of the risen Jesus, the more his current circumstances just become passing details. So, as lockdown and isolation look like remaining a present reality for some time yet, indeed, perhaps it may get even worse, I hope you can find some encouragement from John's experience. These are circumstances in which we can still choose to seek the presence of God. These are circumstances in which we can be assured that God is here to be found. And these are circumstances which are still of no comparison to the rule and the reign of God. That is the kingdom to which we ultimately and eternally belong. Thanks for listening.